Usually when we talk about inheriting property, there's this ingrained expectation of wealth, or at least, some kind of tangible, practical benefit.
Right, like it's the ultimate symbol of passing down a legacy.
Yeah.
You inherit a house, you live in it, generational stability.
Exactly. You inherit a piece of land, you build a cabin on it, or maybe you sell it to put your kids through college. I mean, it's a foundational, almost mythological part of the American dream.
It's how families build wealth over time.
Yeah. But I want you, the listener, to imagine a completely mind-boggling scenario that just turns that entire concept on its head.
Oh, this is such a wild scenario.
It really is. So imagine you receive an official government-stamped notice in the mail. You open it up, and it says you have inherited a piece of property.
Sounds great so far.
Right. But then you look closely at the deed, and your ownership share isn't half. It isn't a quarter. It's not even like 1%. Your legal share of this land is 1/9 millionth of a fraction of the whole.
A mathematical sliver that is so small you couldn't even stand on it if you tried.
And it gets wilder. You sit down at your kitchen table, you pull out a calculator, and you do the math on the income this piece of land generates. And you realize that based on your 1/9 millionth share, it would take exactly 177 years for your specific piece of this inheritance to generate a single solitary penny.
And I think the wildest part of that scenario is that it isn't some hypothetical math puzzle. I mean, that is a documented daily reality for thousands of descendants who are currently navigating this exact system.
It sounds like a glitch in the matrix. I mean, how does a modern legal system even arrive at a mathematical absurdity like that?
It takes over a century of very specific, very destructive policy to get there.
Well, welcome to today's deep dive. We are going to be looking at a piece of legislation from 1887 called the Dawes Act, which is also known in the history books as the General Allotment Act.
Yeah, and it is arguably one of the most profound and honestly destructive pieces of social engineering in American history.
Yeah.
And its shockwaves are still actively shaping reality today.
To really get to the bottom of this, we've pulled from a stack of incredible sources. We're looking at extensive historical records from the 19th century, detailed demographic and administrative data we found compiled on Wikipedia, and legal case summaries.
Specifically, we're looking at a fascinating and really mind-bending 1987 Supreme Court case called Hodel v. Irving.
Right. And the mission here is to explore the profound long-term impacts of the Dawes Act on Native American land loss, because we don't just want to look at what happened in the 1880s as some dusty historical event.
No, we need to understand the compounding mathematical effects over time.
Exactly. Specifically, we are going to unpack the modern administrative nightmare known as fractionation. It's this bureaucratic black hole that continues to haunt the descendants of these policies, literally paralyzing millions of acres of land today. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Because before we can possibly understand the modern mathematical nightmare of waiting 2 centuries for a single penny, we have to travel back to the 1800s. We have to understand the mindset of the U.S. government at the time and what policymakers in Washington broadly termed the Indian problem.
Right. To set the stage properly, we have to look at the sheer demographic pressure that was building in the early 1800s. The United States was experiencing this unprecedented influx of European immigrants.
And they needed somewhere to go.
Exactly. These new arrivals were constantly pushing westward, pressing violently against the eastern borders of Indian territories. And remember, this was where the federal government had already forcefully relocated most Native American tribes during earlier removal policies.
Like the Trail of Tears.
Yes, exactly.
So you essentially have a pressure cooker situation. On one side, you have unending waves of settlers operating under a European legal system of private property and land speculation. And on the other side, you have indigenous nations operating under entirely different cultural, legal, and, well, communal systems.
And the friction was just continuous. So, searching for a quote-unquote quick solution to this friction, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs at the time, a man named William Medill, proposed establishing what he termed colonies.
Which today we know as reservations, right?
Exactly. His policy was to carve out territories exclusively for Native Americans located far out in the region beyond the Mississippi River.
I'm trying to wrap my head around the logic of the time. The idea was basically a policy of total physical segregation.
That was the explicit goal, yeah.
Yeah.
Physical separation.
Just move the tribes far enough west so that the highly coveted southeastern land is entirely freed up for white settlers who are actively lobbying the government for access to new territories.
But Native American tribes didn't just quietly accept this imposition. I mean, they resisted fiercely.
Yeah.
And this resistance led to decades of what were broadly categorized as the Indian Wars in the West.
A prolonged, bloody period of conflict.
Very bloody. It was a clash between indigenous nations defending their homelands and the expanding United States Army.
But the military disparity and those unending waves of settlers eventually forced a tipping point, didn't they?
Yeah. The tribes, facing the full industrialized force of the U.S. military, eventually negotiated treaties and agreements to resettle on these designated reservations.
And the scale of what they retained is actually massive. I mean, according to the historical records we're looking at, Native Americans ended up holding over 155 million acres of land in this reservation system.
Which is huge. To visualize 155 million acres, you have to picture a landmass roughly the size of Texas.
Wow.
And this wasn't just barren wasteland either, as it's sometimes mistakenly portrayed. This land ranged from arid deserts in the southwest to incredibly rich prime agricultural land in the plains and, dense, resource-rich forests in the northwest.
Let me stop and ask a crucial question about how these reservations actually functioned back then. Once they were relocated to this Texas-sized amount of land, how were they living? Because my understanding is that they weren't just given individual deeds to houses like a modern subdivision.
No, not at all. Crucially, under the reservation system established by these treaties, the tribes maintained the legal right to govern themselves.
Okay.
They certainly had to adjust to new, often really challenging locations, but they retained their highly cohesive tribal units. They were still led by their chosen chiefs, they operated through their ancient traditions, and most importantly for our deep dive today, they held the land communally.
Communally. Meaning the tribe as a sovereign entity owned the land, not like John Smith as an individual.
Right, exactly. Everyone in the tribe had a right to live there, to hunt, to farm.
Yeah.
The tribe as a social, cohesive unit was completely intact.
So the land was the physical manifestation of their community.
Yes. But as we move out of the Indian Wars and into the late 1880s, the ideological winds in Washington change abruptly.
Oh, here we go.
Yeah. The era of physical separation ends, and the era of forced cultural assimilation begins.
I need to play devil's advocate here for a second. Why change a system that had just been established after decades of horrific war? They finally have a system of reservations. Why upend it?
Well, the reformers, politicians, and East Coast philanthropists looked at the reservations and decided that keeping Native Americans isolated just wasn't working.
Working for who, though?
Right, exactly. They argued that the frontier was closing, white settlement was going to surround these reservations anyway, and that completely assimilating Native Americans into mainstream white American culture was the only way to ensure their survival.
It's a dark irony. Even the people who claim to admire Native Americans, the self-proclaimed friends of the Indian, believed this.
They genuinely did.
They fundamentally believed that for the indigenous person to survive, the indigenous culture had to die. They believed the tribes needed to abandon their communal landholding, their ancient traditions, and their very identities.
And the central champion of this new aggressive assimilation approach was Senator Henry Dawes of Massachusetts. He launched a massive legislative campaign to, in his exact words, rid the nation of tribalism.
Wow.
And the weapon he chose to accomplish this wasn't the U.S. cavalry, it was the legal concept of private property.
I want to pause here because this is such a massive, almost incomprehensible paradigm shift. Let's try to visualize this. Imagine you, the listener, live in a town where everyone shares a massive, thriving community garden.
Okay, I like this analogy.
Right. It's just how your people have lived for 1,000 years. The land belongs to everyone, it provides for everyone, and your social status is based on how well you contribute to the whole.
It's a completely interconnected ecosystem of survival and social bond.
Exactly. Then, a bureaucrat from a capital city 2,000 miles away shows up in your town. They look at your thriving garden and say, "This is primitive. To make you better, more civilized citizens, we are going to carve this community garden up. We're going to put up fences, give everyone a tiny isolated square, and then we're going to sell the rest of the garden to complete strangers."
Strangers who just want to make a profit.
Yeah. You didn't ask for it, you don't want it, but the military is backing them up, so it's happening.
That analogy captures the exact violence of the policy, because the core belief driving Senator Dawes and his allies was that communal living was inherently uncivilized. They literally thought it bred laziness.
That is so arrogant.
It was very arrogant. In their Victorian capitalist worldview, the only way to be a prosperous, self-supporting American citizen was to embrace the idea of land as real estate. It had to be something you owned individually, something you fenced off, developed for personal profit, and could buy or sell.
When you realize that land wasn't just property to these tribes, but literally their cultural operating system, this whole policy takes on a much darker tone. It completely rewrites the DNA of a society when you turn a shared ancestral home into a tradable commodity.
The destruction of the tribal unit was the explicit goal, and that brings us to the actual physical mechanics of how this was executed. On February 8, 1887, President Grover Cleveland officially signed the Dawes Severalty Act, the General Allotment Act, into law.
Okay, let's get into the nuts and bolts. How exactly did Senator Dawes and President Cleveland legally mandate the carving up of this metaphorical community garden? According to our sources, the legislation had 6 very specific stated goals.
Right. The reformers intended to accomplish 6 things. First, break up the tribes as a cohesive social unit. Second, encourage individual initiative and competition. Third, further the progress of native farmers by making them reliant on their own plots.
Okay, that's 3.
Fourth, reduce the massive cost of native administration for the federal government. Fifth, secure specific parts of the reservations securely as Indian land. And sixth, open the remainder of the surplus land to white settlers for profit.
That 6th goal, opening the remainder of the land for profit, is doing an unbelievable amount of heavy lifting, and we will absolutely spend time on that.
Oh, definitely.
But first, let's look at the actual math of the allotments. When the surveyors showed up, how much of the garden did an individual actually get?
The math was rigidly laid out in the Act. A designated head of a family would receive a grant of 160 acres. A single person or an orphan over the age of 18 would receive 80 acres. And any person under the age of 18 would receive a 40-acre parcel.
Now, I know enough about property law to know you can't just hand someone a deed and expect them to instantly know how to navigate the American real estate market, especially if they've never participated in a cash economy. Did they just hand over the deeds on day one?
They absolutely did not. The legislation came with major strings attached. The allotments were to be held in trust by the U.S. government for a period of 25 years.
Let's do a quick ELI 5 explain, like I'm 5 on what held in trust actually means in this 1887 context. If the government holds it in trust, what does the Native American farmer actually have?
Think of it like a parent opening a bank account for a teenager. The teenager can use the money for approved things, but the parent's name is on the account and the parent has the ultimate veto power over major decisions.
So they can't just drain the account.
Right. In this case, the U.S. government held the actual legal title to the land. The Native American allottee had the right to live on it and farm it, but they legally could not sell it, lease it to outsiders, or use it as collateral for a loan for 25 years.
And what was the reasoning behind that?
Well, the paternalistic theory was that this 25-year window would protect the new property owners from predatory white land speculators while they learned how to be, quote-unquote, civilized subsistence farmers.
There was also a massive legal carrot dangled in front of them regarding citizenship, wasn't there?
There was. The act included a specific citizenship clause. It stated that Native Americans who accepted their land allotment and voluntarily adopted the habits of civilized life, which was explicitly defined as moving away from the tribal community and living separately, were granted United States citizenship.
What's fascinating here is the sheer suffocating paternalism of the entire framework.
It's astounding.
The government is looking at sovereign people and saying, we are going to force you to assume a capitalist proprietary relationship with property, a concept that doesn't even exist in your language. And if you perform this role well enough, we'll let you be citizens.
And they didn't even give them time to think about it. The act put them on a ticking clock. Eligible Native Americans were given exactly 4 years from the time the act was applied to their reservation to select their specific piece of land.
Wait, what happens if someone fundamentally disagrees with this? What if a tribal member says, I reject this premise. I am not picking a plot of land. I refuse.
The law actually anticipated that resistance. If an eligible person refused to choose a plot or simply didn't pick one within the 4-year window, the Secretary of the Interior was legally empowered to just pick the land for them.
So it was completely mandatory.
Utterly mandatory. There was no opting out of the Dawes Act.
I'm trying to wrap my head around the logical gymnastics of this policy. The stated goal, Goal number 2 is to encourage individual initiative. They wanted to turn Native Americans into independent, self-reliant yeoman farmers.
Right.
But the government is attempting to create this independence by imposing a completely alien, mandatory, heavily supervised system on people against their will. You are literally forcing someone to be independent by making every single life choice for them under threat of federal law.
It is the ultimate contradiction of colonial policy. I mean, it was a massive forced engineering project on human society.
Yeah.
But practically speaking, before the federal government could hand out these 160-acre plots, they ran into a monumental bureaucratic wall. To hand out land to eligible individuals, you first have to legally define who exactly is eligible.
You have to define what makes someone an Indian in the eyes of a federal court. Which brings us to what the sources reveal as one of the most destructive, pseudoscientific, and long-lasting aspects of the Dawes Act.
The blood quantum.
Exactly. The process of deciding who was Indian enough to get a piece of their own homeland.
To manage this staggering logistical nightmare, Congress established the Dawes Commission in 1893. Their specific, monumental task was to register the members of the so-called 5 civilized tribes in Indian Territory.
And that was the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, and Seminole, right?
Yes. Now, these tribes had initially been exempt from the 1887 Act due to prior treaties. But of course, the government eventually reneged on those promises and brought them under the allotment system as well.
So you have federal agents, bureaucrats from Washington showing up in Indian Territory. Paint a picture of what this actually looked like on the ground. How do they actually register people?
Imagine federal agents setting up large canvas tents in the middle of these territories. You have long lines of tribal members, many of whom didn't speak English, standing with translators, facing clerks with massive leather-bound ledgers.
Just a completely bureaucratic setup.
Totally. And these clerks were tasked with determining the racial makeup of every single person who stepped up to the table. And to do this, they implemented a concept called blood quantum.
Well, let's be crystal clear about this based on the historical record. The concept of blood quantum in the 1890s wasn't based on genetics or DNA testing. It was a completely specious, unscientific implementation.
There was absolutely zero scientific method available in the 1890s for determining precise biological bloodlines. None. The commission members, these bureaucratic clerks, effectively created an arbitrary division based heavily on outward appearance, the clothes a person wore, and their perceived level of assimilation.
So they were quite literally just looking at people's faces, guessing their heritage, and writing it down as unchangeable federal law.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. And they divided people into 2 very distinct legal categories: full-bloods and mixed-bloods.
And the consequences of those 2 labels were drastically different, right? I mean, they dictated a person's entire economic future.
Oh, entirely. Individuals who were perceived as poorly assimilated or who appeared phenotypically indigenous and were thus labeled full-blood were legally deemed incompetent to manage their own affairs by the federal government.
Wait, so if a clerk decided you looked like a full-blood, you were instantly declared legally incompetent. What did that mean for your land?
It meant you were given relatively small parcels of land deeded with trust patents. The government retained complete control over the land, the leasing rights, and any money it generated.
And what about the people the clerks categorized as mixed bloods?
Well, those who most resembled whites or who spoke English well and were deemed assimilated were labeled mixed bloods. The clerks assumed that because they had white heritage, they were inherently more capable of handling business.
Of course they did.
Right, so they were given larger, better tracts of land with patents in fee simple.
Let's do another ELI 5. What does fee simple mean for someone walking out of that tent?
Fee simple is the highest form of property ownership in English law. It means you own the land completely outright. You can sell it, mortgage it, leave it in your will to whoever you want. You have complete control.
Sounds like a much better deal.
But the catch for the mixed bloods was that to receive this fee simple land, they were forced to accept U.S. citizenship and legally relinquish their tribal status entirely.
I have to stop and point out the absurdity here. If there was no scientific method to determine precise bloodlines in the 1890s, wasn't this entire categorization just based on vibes and prejudice? They literally just looked at people and guessed.
It was purely subjective categorization masquerading as legal science. The historical record shows that family members, full siblings, were often categorized differently just because they spoke to different clerks on different days.
That is mind-blowing.
And the real tragedy is that the Dawes Act legally preempted the sovereign right of Native American tribes to define themselves. For centuries, tribal belonging was cultural, it was familial, it was communal, it was about who you claimed and who claimed you.
And overnight, it was reduced to a biological fraction dictated by federal bureaucrats.
Exactly.
What happened to the people who walked up to the tent, but the clerks decided they didn't meet the arbitrary criteria to be placed on these rolls at all?
They were legally detribalized. They were stripped of their American Indian identity under the law, denied any land allotment, and displaced from their homelands.
Just completely erased from the system.
Yes, the source material poignantly describes them as being discarded into the nebula of American otherness. And the devastating part is that this blood quantum system didn't just stop with the Dawes Act.
Right, it became a long-lasting federal tool.
Exactly. The federal government found this spreadsheet approach to identity so administratively convenient that they continued using it for decades to dispense or deny other vital resources like healthcare, housing, and educational funding.
It's quite literally identity by spreadsheet. So the identities are arbitrarily assigned, the tribal rolls are drawn up, the ledgers are closed, and the 160-acre parcels are handed out to the head of each recognized family. But let's do the math on the land itself.
Let's do it.
Earlier, we established that the tribes held roughly 155 million acres. Once you carve out 160 acres for the men, 80 for the single folks, and 40 for the kids, there is a massive, staggering amount of land left over. What happened to the rest of the reservation?
This is where goal number 6 of the Dawes Act comes crashing down on the tribes, opening the remainder of the land to white settlers for profit. Any land within the reservation boundaries that was not allotted to a registered Native American was officially declared by the government to be surplus.
Surplus! Such a clinical, sterile word for someone else's ancestral homeland.
It was a legal fiction designed to justify a land grab. The moment that land was declared surplus, the federal government swooped in and quickly sold it off.
Just auctioned it to the highest bidder.
Pretty much. It was optioned to non-native settlers, granted to railroad companies pushing west, sold to large timber and mining corporations, or converted into federal parks and military compounds.
Okay, so the surplus land is immediately gone, stolen legally. But surely the allotted land, the 160-acre parcels that were locked in that 25-year trust we talked about, surely that land was safe, right? I mean, the whole point of the trust was that it couldn't be sold. So how did they end up losing that land too? The math isn't mathing here.
To understand how the protected land was lost, we have to look at an amendment passed in 1906 called the Burke Act, which historians often refer to as the Forced Patenting Act.
Okay, what did the Burke Act do?
It completely undermined the 25-year trust protection. It gave the Secretary of the Interior the immense unilateral power to look at any Native American allottee and declare them competent and capable of managing their own affairs before the 25 years were up.
On the surface, that sounds almost positive, getting deemed competent by the government, like you graduated to full citizenship.
It was pitched as a graduation, but it was actually a meticulously designed trap for massive land transfer. When the Secretary declared an allottee competent, their land was immediately stripped of its trust status. The allottee was issued that patent in fee simple we discussed earlier. They owned it outright.
But if they own it outright, they don't have to sell it. Why did this lead to them losing it? Let's ELI 5 the trap.
The trap was taxes. The moment the land was taken out of federal trust, it became subject to state and local property taxes.
Oh, wow.
Now, remember who we were talking about. These are newly designated subsistence farmers who have been forced onto individual plots. They have very little access to credit, no access to modern agricultural markets, and they are operating in an economy that has deliberately marginalized them.
So a government agent hands them a piece of paper saying, "Congratulations, you are competent." And a week later, the county tax assessor hands them a bill for property taxes payable in cash they absolutely do not have.
Precisely. And when they inevitably couldn't pay those new cash tax burdens, the local government would foreclose on the property. The land would be seized and sold at public auction to white buyers, often for pennies on the dollar.
That is institutional cruelty masquerading as progress. Did the people in Washington writing these laws know this was going to happen?
The Department of the Interior absolutely knew. The historical sources note that it was widely understood within the department that virtually 95% of all fee-patented land would eventually be lost to white buyers through tax foreclosures, fraud, or distress sales.
Let's look at the final tally of this era. What was the ultimate cost of the Dawes Act and the Burke Act?
The numbers are almost too large to comprehend. In 1887, before the Dawes Act was passed, Native Americans collectively owned roughly 138 million acres of land.
Okay.
By 1934, when the federal government finally stopped the allotment policy, Native Americans owned just 48 million acres.
I need everyone to hear that math clearly. Over 47 years, they lost 90 million acres of land. That is nearly two-thirds of their entire 1887 land base simply evaporating into white ownership,
Yeah, it's staggering.
and the human cost. As a result of this policy, 90,000 Native Americans, which was roughly two-thirds of their entire population at the time, were made entirely hopelessly landless.
They were turned into refugees in their own country. And it's vital to note that this outcome was not a surprise to everyone in Washington. There were loud voices calling out exactly what this was from the very beginning.
Right, like Senator Henry M. Teller of Colorado. He was an incredibly outspoken opponent of the allotment policy.
He was.
I read his quotes in the source material, and they are chillingly accurate. In 1881, as the ideas for this act were being debated, he stated plainly that the real aim of the policy was to get at the Indian lands and open them up to settlement. He actually went on the Senate floor and called it a policy to despoil the Indians of their lands and to make them vagabonds on the face of the earth.
Teller saw right through the paternalistic rhetoric. He pointed out that the provisions claiming to benefit Native Americans were just a smokescreen. He argued that if this dispossession were done purely out of naked greed, it would be bad enough, but to do it under the self-righteous guise of humanity and civilization made it infinitely worse.
And his warnings were completely validated by later historians. Angie Debo, a pioneering historian, wrote a landmark, explosive book in 1940 called And Still the Waters Run.
An incredibly important book.
It is an incredibly detailed, exhaustive account of the systematic manipulation, the rampant corruption, and the sheer moral depravity used by white administrators, lawyers, and businessmen to deprive the 5 civilized tribes of their resources.
The evidence of fraud was overwhelming. Even Henry Dawes himself, the architect of the act, the man who believed he was saving Native Americans, seemed to recognize the monster he had unleashed. Just 3 years after the act passed, in 1890, he cynically remarked, "I never knew a white man to get his foot on an Indian's land who ever took it off."
It's an unbelievable systemic transfer of generational wealth. But the Dawes Act wasn't just a massive real estate transaction, was it? We talked earlier about destroying the tribal unit. The act was simultaneously a psychological and cultural weapon designed to reach into the home and fundamentally restructure the Native American family.
That is a crucial layer to this history. The Office of Indian Affairs wasn't just trying to redraw property lines on a map. They were actively trying to change human behavior and psychology.
How so?
Well, the Dawes Act actually included specific funding provisions to instruct Native Americans in Euro-American patterns of thought. This money was funneled into the Indian service schools, including the notorious boarding schools.
They didn't just teach English and math, they literally outlawed Native American cultural practices. They established a draconian code of Indian offenses that regulated individual behavior, religious practices, and ceremonies according to strict Euro-American Christian norms.
Right, and if you violated these rules, you were tried in special courts of Indian offenses set up directly on the reservations.
They criminalized the culture.
They did. And if we look closely at the sociological impact, an incredibly important yet often overlooked objective of the Dawes Act was to entirely restructure Indigenous gender roles.
Here's where it gets really interesting and where the sheer arrogance of the colonial mindset is so starkly exposed. In many Indigenous tribes, particularly agricultural ones, women performed what white Victorian settlers considered to be strictly male tasks.
Yes, like heavy farming, home building, construction, and supply gathering.
Right. And within the tribal structure, these weren't menial tasks. These gendered roles accorded Indigenous women high esteem, economic power, and significant social status within the community. They controlled the food supply, they owned the homes they built, they were the primary providers and the economic bedrock of the tribe.
But when the white settlers, the federal agents, and the East Coast reformers arrived and saw this, they completely misinterpreted it through their own patriarchal lens. They looked at these powerful working women and judged their labor as low status. The source material states they saw this as a sign of Indigenous women's, quote-unquote, disempowerment and drudgery.
You have to understand the evolutionary perspective of the late 19th century white reformer. In their Victorian worldview, the pinnacle of civilization was a woman sitting indoors, performing light domestic duties, entirely dependent on a male wage earner.
So they viewed Indigenous women doing agricultural or construction work not as empowerment, but as a primitive corruption of natural gender roles. They saw it as an absolute impediment to societal progress.
I am continually amazed by the hubris. They basically looked at a society where women had economic independence, property rights, and high social standing and said, we're going to rescue these poor women by taking away the very work that gives them power and making them completely dependent on men.
That is exactly what they did. They used environmental and property changes to force massive social change. The legislators aggressively promoted Christian marriages. They forced extended communal families to break apart and regroup under strict nuclear households led by a designated male head.
They often enforced this by literally renaming people on the Dawes rolls, didn't they? Giving them English surnames derived from the husband or father.
Yep. They erased matrilineal naming systems overnight.
Wow.
They then trained the men in wage-earning occupations or heavy subsistence farming, giving the men the plows and the seeds. Meanwhile, they actively pressured the women to step back from the fields and retreat into domestic, indoor activities, sewing, cleaning, cooking, to merely support the men.
So the explicit goal was to create a system of economic dependency strictly within a small, male-dominated nuclear unit.
Precisely.
So under the banner of civilization and progress, they intentionally dismantled a functioning system of female empowerment and replaced it with forced economic domesticity. It's profound how deeply this piece of real estate legislation reached into the living rooms, the marriages, and the daily lives of the people it targeted.
It was a totalizing, inescapable policy. But as destructive as all of this was, the sale of the surplus land, the attack on culture, the rewriting of gender roles, we still have to address the elephant in the room.
Right. What happened to the land that was kept? The 48 million acres that somehow survived the Burke Act and the tax foreclosures and remained in Native American hands. What happened to those specific allotted parcels over the next century?
And this brings us to the core issue, the absolute mechanical heart of today's deep dive, the modern administrative nightmare, the phenomenon known as fractionation.
Okay, let's unpack this concept clearly because it is the engine of the bureaucratic black hole we mentioned at the very start of the show. Explain the mechanics of fractionation to me like I'm a first-year law student trying to understand trusts.
To understand fractionation, you just have to follow the basic mathematical rules of inheritance applied to a trust property over multiple generations. Let's start at the beginning. An original allottee, let's call him Generation 1, receives his 160-acre parcel in 1890. It is held in federal trust.
Okay, got it.
When Generation 1 dies, the federal government does not physically divide the 160 acres into smaller, fenced-off plots for his children.
Because the land is held in trust, the physical boundaries remain completely intact.
Correct. The physical land remains whole. Instead, the heirs receive equal, undivided interest in the entire parcel.
Undivided is the absolute key word there. Let's make this concrete. If I inherit property with my sister, I don't get the north 80 acres and she gets the south 80 acres. We don't get separate deeds.
No. You both own a 50% undivided interest in the whole 160 acres. You own 50% of every blade of grass, and she owns 50% of every blade of grass.
Okay, that makes sense for one generation. But then I have 4 kids, and my sister has 4 kids. When we both eventually pass away, our children inherit our shares. Now, instead of 2 owners, those 8 kids own an equal, undivided 12.5% interest in the exact same 160 acres.
And when those 8 heirs die, their shares divide again among their children. And because Native American families, like any families, grow, marry, and branch out, this fractionated interest doesn't just grow linearly. It expands exponentially with each passing generation.
And the terrifying part is this hasn't been happening for just 2 or 3 generations. This mathematical splitting has been happening continuously, generation after generation, for over 130 years since the Dawes Act was passed.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the scale of this math problem today is genuinely staggering. Let's look at the data. In 2004, a man named Ross Swimmer, who was serving as the special trustee for American Indians at the Department of the Interior, testified before Congress about this exact crisis.
What did he tell them?
He presented the math. He stated that there were approximately 4 million individual owner interests spread across just 10 million acres of individually owned trust lands.
Wait, 4 million distinct, legally binding owner interests on just 10 million acres. That's an average of 1 owner for every 2.5 acres, but all mixed together in a giant legal suit.
And he warned Congress that unless a radically aggressive approach was taken to consolidate this land, those 4 million interests were mathematically projected to expand to 11 million interests by the year 2030.
Think about our community garden analogy from earlier, and let's update it for the modern era to understand why this is so paralyzing. Let's say you inherit a nice vacation cabin in the woods with your 4 siblings. You all own a 20% undivided interest. It's a little annoying to schedule who gets it on Labor Day, but you manage.
Right, 20% is manageable.
Now imagine your kids inherit it, and their kids and their kids. 3 generations later, 100 people, most of whom have never even met each other, own an undivided interest in this one cabin.
Now the roof starts leaking.
Exactly. The roof leaks and you want to fix it. Or maybe a logging company wants to pay you to harvest some timber on the land. But legally, because it's an undivided interest in a federal trust, you can't just fix it yourself. You need a legally binding consensus, signatures from 100 different owners scattered across all 50 states just to authorize a lease, a repair, or a sale.
And that is exactly what happens on the reservations. The land becomes completely, utterly administratively paralyzed. In fact, real estate appraisal studies cited in the sources suggest that once a single tract of land has between 10 and 20 individual owners, the commercial value of that tract effectively drops to zero.
Drops to zero. Because the transaction costs, finding everyone, getting a notary, getting them to agree, processing the federal paperwork, vastly exceed whatever money the land could possibly generate.
It becomes literally impossible to lease the land for agriculture, to build a home on it, or to develop it for commercial use.
Yeah.
The land becomes dead capital. It sits empty, growing weeds, while the people who theoretically own it live in poverty nearby.
To truly understand how paralyzing this is, how deeply it breaks the administrative system, we need to stop speaking in abstracts. We need to look at a specific real-world example from the sources. Let's look deeply into Tract 1305.
Oh, Tract 1305. This is perhaps the most famous piece of fractionated land in legal history. It was a specific 40-acre parcel of allotted land located on a Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. It was highlighted as the prime example in a pivotal 1987 Supreme Court case, Hodel v. Irving.
And the data on this single tract is the perfect, terrifying illustration of how fractionation destroys value, isn't it?
It really is. Let's walk through the numbers. Lay out the exact reality of Tract 1305 as it stood in 1987 during the Supreme Court case.
Okay, hit me with the numbers.
In 1987, this 40-acre tract was appraised at a value of $8,000. It was being leased out and produced a total of $1,080 a year in rental income. But because of continuous fractionation since the allotment era, that 40 acres had 439 separate legal owners.
439 owners for a plot of land the size of a medium shopping center.
Yes. And let's look at how that $1,080 of income was divided among those 439 people. 1/3 of those owners received a rental check for less than 5 cents for the entire year.
5 cents for a whole year.
2/3 of the owners received less than a single dollar. The absolute largest interest holder, the person with the biggest chunk, received just $82.85 a year.
I'm trying to imagine the math the accountants had to do.
It required supercomputers. To calculate the fractional interests accurately, the federal government had to use a common denominator of over 3.3 trillion.
Trillion. With a T, they are slicing 40 acres into 3.3 trillion hypothetical pieces to figure out who gets a nickel.
And this brings us back to the hook of our deep dive. The smallest heir of Tract 1305, the person with the most microscopic fraction of ownership, received a fractional payout so small that it would take exactly 177 years of accumulated rent to equal one single penny.
It is beyond absurd. It's a comedy of bureaucratic errors. And let's play this out. If they somehow miraculously got all 439 people to sign a piece of paper agreeing to sell the land outright for its $8,000 appraised value, what would that smallest heir get from the sale?
If the land were sold for $8,000, that smallest heir would be legally entitled to roughly 4/100ths of a single cent.
But here is the thing that truly breaks my brain. Someone has to do all this math. This isn't just an abstract theoretical problem on a chalkboard. Someone sitting in a government office has to track all 439 of these people, update their addresses when they move, legally process their fractions of a cent, print the ledgers, and mail the notices.
That monumental Sisyphean task falls entirely on the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the BIA, which is part of the Department of the Interior. And in 1987, during the court case, the administrative cost to the BIA, the taxpayer money spent paying clerks, printing paper, and mailing envelopes just to handle the yearly paperwork for this one single 40-acre tract of land, was estimated at $17,560 a year.
Wait, stop. Let me make sure I'm hearing you correctly. The land itself only produced $1,080 a year in actual income, but it cost the government $17,560 a year just to manage the ledger, dividing up that $1,080.
Yes, they were spending 17 times more money to manage the land than the land actually produced. And the horrifying part is it only gets worse. The sources track the history of this exact same piece of property, track 1305, forward to the year 2003.
Okay, what happened over those 16 years?
By 2003, the track's value had increased to $22,000, and it produced $2,000 in annual income. But the older generation had died, passing their shares to their children. The number of owners had grown from 439 to 505. The common denominator required to calculate the shares had ballooned from 3.3 trillion to 220 trillion. The exact denominator was 220 billion, 670 billion, 49,600,000.
And the administrative cost to the government in 2003?
The administrative cost to taxpayers ballooned to $42,800 a year for that single $2,000 a year piece of land.
This is an amazing, tragic paradox. Let's think back to the beginning of the deep dive. One of the original stated 6 goals of the Dawes Act, written by Senator Dawes himself, was to, quote, reduce the cost of native administration.
Yeah, that really backfired.
They honestly thought that breaking up the tribes and handing out individual property would make things cheaper and easier for the federal budget. Instead, they birthed an eternal bureaucratic black hole where the government spends infinitely more money processing the paperwork than the land actually produces.
And the most frustrating part is that the Department of the Interior has no choice but to manage it. They are trapped in a prison of their own making. Unlike most private trusts, where a bank can simply refuse to manage an account that holds less than $100 because it isn't profitable, the federal government bears the entire legal and financial cost of administering the Indian trust. They have no commercial incentive or legal ability to just close small accounts.
So what happens when someone who owns an interest that generates 2 cents a year dies? The BIA has to process that death, right?
Yes. Under current federal regulations, legal probates need to be conducted for every individual account with trust assets when the owner dies, regardless of the value. Even if the account balance is literally between 1 cent and $1, a federal judge has to probate it.
Let me ELI 5, the probate process, so people understand how insane this is. A probate means lawyers, judges, gathering death certificates, tracking down heirs, holding hearings, and issuing legal orders. They have to do a full legal probate for an account that holds 15 cents.
They do. A streamlined, bare-bones probate process costs the government a minimum of $500 in administrative overhead. So the government reported to Congress that to probate the roughly $5,700 total held across all these tiny fractional accounts in the entire system, it would cost the taxpayers almost $10 million in administrative fees.
Spending $10 million to legally distribute $5,000. It is a system completely irreversibly divorced from logic, economics, or reality. So how has the government tried to clean up a mess that has been spiraling so disastrously out of control for over a century? Has there been any accountability? Did anyone try to stop it before it got to 220 trillion denominators?
The alarm bells were actually rung fairly early on. In 1928, there was a major comprehensive study commissioned by the Secretary of the Interior called the Merriam Report. It extensively documented the massive fraud, the crushing poverty, and the misappropriation of the allotment era.
Oh, good. So they knew.
And buried in that report, it revealed that the government already knew the math was failing. As early as 1922, an audit by the General Accounting Office found that for just 80,000 discrete Native American owners, the government was already managing over 1 million fractional ownership records.
So they knew in the 1920s that the exponential math was broken.
They absolutely knew. The GAO noted back then that if the land were physically divided by these fractional interests rather than held undivided, many owners would receive less than 1 square foot of ground.
A square foot? You couldn't even stand on your own property with 2 feet. Did Congress do anything about the Merriam Report?
Eventually, yes. During the Great Depression, the Roosevelt administration passed the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which is often called the Indian New Deal. This act finally, legally stopped the allotment process. It formally prohibited any further carving up of the reservations.
But let me guess, it was basically shutting the barn door after the horses had already run away, been sold, and died.
Exactly. It stopped new allotments from being created. But due to heavy lobbying and opposition from white ranchers and corporate interests, who were making a fortune leasing these paralyzed, fractionated lands for pennies on the dollar because the owners couldn't organize to demand fair prices, the final version of the 1934 Act was gutted.
So it didn't fix the fractionation problem at all.
No, it failed to meaningfully address the land consolidation and fractionation that had already happened. It left the existing trusts in place. It didn't fix the math.
Which leaves us with the staggering multi-billion-dollar bureaucracy of today. Let's look at the BIA's massive trust management responsibilities right now. How big is this ledger today?
Today, the Interior Department is involved in the active management of roughly 100,000 leases on trust land, encompassing about 56 million acres. They collect and distribute about $226 million per year for approximately 230,000 individual Indian money accounts, and they manage billions in tribal funds.
And it doesn't take a genius to realize that when you have a chronically underfunded government accounting system trying to manage hundreds of thousands of accounts using fractions of pennies based on 130-year-old ledgers, things are going to go wrong.
Massively, criminally wrong. The BIA's alleged improper management, missing ledgers, and outright loss of this trust fund money resulted in decades of bitter litigation.
This is the Cobell case, right?
Yes. The most famous and consequential is the class action lawsuit Cobell v. Kempthorne, spearheaded by Eloise Cobell, a Blackfeet Nation banker. That case was eventually settled in 2009. The federal government had to pay out $3.4 billion to Native American account holders because the government simply could not produce the paperwork or properly account for the revenues they were supposed to be holding in trust. They literally lost track of the fractions.
$3.4 billion. And that's just the financial accounting of it. That's just the ledgers and the lawsuits. But I want to pull back from the math for a second and look at the actual human beings involved.
That's the most important part.
You take away 90 million acres of land. You break up the communal family structure. You force people into a cash economy with no cash. You throw generations into deep poverty while they technically own land they can't touch. That kind of sustained, multi-generational trauma has to leave deep physical scars on a population.
It does. And the data bears that out in horrifying detail. Recent literature and demographic studies have found empirical evidence of profound health impacts stemming directly from the allotment policy. The data shows that for the communities subjected to the Dawes Act, the policy led to sharp increases in child mortality. And most staggeringly, it resulted in a 20% decrease in life expectancy for the affected Native communities compared to non-allotted populations.
Let's pause on that. A 20% drop in life expectancy. We spend so much time talking about public policy in these abstract, sterile, bureaucratic terms, trusts, allotments, fee simple denominators. But a 20% drop in life expectancy means this wasn't just a bad real estate deal. This wasn't just an administrative oopsie. This was a lethal policy. It killed people.
It systematically shortened the lives of the people it claimed it was trying to civilize.
Mm-hmm.
And this highlights a crucial reality that we have to confront. The Dawes Act isn't just a dusty historical artifact from 1887. It isn't a closed chapter in a textbook. It is an active, ongoing, daily crisis.
Because the government hasn't fixed the system.
Right. The federal government still hasn't adopted the modern legal tools that states or local governments use to return abandoned or highly fractionated property to productive community use. So the trust continues, the owners multiply, the fractions get smaller, and the land remains dead and paralyzed.
So what does this all mean? When we zoom out and look at this entire century-and-a-half-long story, it means that a self-righteous attempt to force cultural assimilation via the concept of private property ownership resulted in stolen wealth, lost culture, and quite literally an unsolvable math problem. They took a functioning, resilient communal society, aggressively imposed a rigid European grid of individualism over it, and in the process, they broke both the society and the grid itself.
It stands as a monumental testament to the unintended, or perhaps, if you read Senator Teller's quotes, the entirely intended consequences of top-down colonial social engineering. You cannot force a culture to change its relationship to the earth by handing them a ledger.
We've covered incredible heavy ground today. We started by looking at a vibrant 155 million acre reservation system sustained by ancient communal traditions. We watched the Dawes Act violently force privatization onto that land. We saw the destructive, unscientific use of blood quantum by federal clerks to legally erase Indigenous identities. We witnessed the devastating, calculated loss of 90 million acres of tribal land to tax traps and corporate greed in just a few decades. And finally, we explored the bizarre, paralyzing modern reality of fractionation, where an inheritance becomes a $40,000 a year administrative burden for a piece of land worth half that.
It is an incredibly complex, painful legacy that demands our attention, primarily because the ledger is still open. The government is still processing the paperwork, and the fractions are still dividing today.
I want to leave you, the listener, with something tangible to think about. The next time you sit down at a desk to sign a piece of property paperwork, whether it's closing on a mortgage, signing a rental lease, or drafting a will, I want you to think about how those laws of inheritance and ownership, which seem so incredibly mundane and normal to us, can actually be weaponized. Think about how a simple deed, a piece of paper with a signature, can be used to dismantle an entire culture. And think about how a bureaucracy can blindly outlive its creators to haunt descendants centuries later, meticulously doing the math to send them a penny every 177 years.
I'll leave you with a final thought to mull over, building directly on that math. If the current trajectory holds and we actually reach 11 million fractional interests by the year 2030, does there come a legal and philosophical point where the very concept of ownership itself completely breaks down? Think about it. When a piece of land has more legal owners than it has grains of soil, who really owns it?
That is the perfect, unsettling question to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources, and as always, keep questioning the systems built around you.